So thank you all for coming back promptly. I hope you enjoyed your coffee break. So I think following on the last presentation, which had a lot to say about Greece, and it was very interesting paper from an economic perspective. Now we'll move on to this session to discuss the case of Greece more thoroughly from academics who are Greek, some coming from Cyprus, others from the UK, with our UK scholars studying the case of Greece, which is very encouraging, I think, for introducing important ideas to Greeks also in this country. So as I had mentioned at the outset, we have a change in the program. So we'll have Dr. Papadopoulos discussing on privatized companies, golden shares and property ownership to begin with, then Mrs. Ioanna Damboudi, and finally Mr. Kyriakidis. So we'll start off with Thomas.
So I would like to thank the organizers of this event. It's a great honor for me. I'm glad to be here because this event is also co-organized by my alma mater, the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki. My presentation is based on an article that was published in European Company and Financial Law Review, and was also published in the research papers of the Eliamep think tank. My paper will analyze the contribution of Case 244 of 2011, Commission versus Greece, to the scope of Article 345 on property ownership. My analysis will take place in the broader context of over-indebted member states. Special emphasis will be given on Greek and Cypriot memoranda of understanding as parts of their bailout agreements. Now, case Commission versus Greece 245 of 2011 was one of the last golden shares cases that was decided by the European Court of Justice. Greece had enacted a scheme of prior authorization and of ex post control in certain privatized undertakings, and the European Court of Justice found that this national privatization law of Greece infringed the EU fundamental freedoms, and more specifically, the freedom of establishment and the free movement of capital. But first of all, let's give a definition for golden shares. Golden shares are special rights that member states are enjoying in privatized undertakings. These special rights consist of veto rights, restrictions on acquisitions of shareholdings, voting caps, appointment of board members, etc. Many member states introduced these golden shares in their privatized undertakings. The European Commission argued that these laws, these golden shares, infringed two fundamental freedoms, the freedom of establishment and the free movement of capital. As a matter of fact, the European Commission initiated infringement proceedings before the European Court of Justice, and we had many cases decided by the ECJ on golden shares. Here is a list of them. In all these cases, the ECJ declared the incompatibility of golden shares with internal market law. Only in one case, in Belgium, the member state managed to justify this restriction. Of course, my presentation will focus only on a specific part of this thread of case law. We will focus only on the last case, the Commission versus Greece. We will discuss the neutrality of the treaties towards national provisions governing property ownership. Article 345 states that the treaties shall in no way prejudice the rules in member states governing system of property ownership. So member states are free to proceed to nationalization of private properties or to privatization of state properties. The policy choices of member states regarding privatizations fall outside the scope of the treaties. In our case, Greece invoked this article, Article 345, in order to insulate its national privatization law, this golden search that Greece had introduced, from the scope of EU fundamental freedoms. Here I'm citing the relevant extract from the case. Of course, I'm not going to read it now, it's quite long, and I'm afraid that I don't have the time. But Greece invoked this specific article in order to escape fundamental freedoms. The Court of Justice of the EU rejected this argument and scrutinized Greek legislation in the light of fundamental freedoms. Now, this case, Commission versus Greece, assists us in identifying the outer limits of Article 345 on property ownership, and also in drawing the boundaries between Article 345 and EU fundamental freedoms. The court adopted a quite narrow interpretation of this article, a national rule falling within the scope of Article 345 is not caught by the fundamental freedoms. The free movement rules take a second place here. And the ECJ is aware that the narrower the scope of of the fundamental freedoms, the wider the scope of Article 345 is. This narrow interpretation was adopted by the ECJ in order to stop member states invoking this article in order to insulate their privatization laws from the fundamental freedoms. So, a distinction between a property right, which is governed by national property laws, and the exercise of such a right, which must comply with the fundamental freedoms, could be drawn in the context of golden shares. We must distinguish between the existence of a golden share and the exercise of golden shares. We must distinguish between the introduction of a golden share in a privatization law and the content of this golden share. On the one hand, Article 345 catches privatization laws, the policy decisions on a privatization. And of course, these policy decisions are escaping the scope of fundamental freedoms. On the other hand, the content of this golden share, as well as the exercise of these golden shares, fall within the scope of fundamental freedoms, but escape the scope of Article 345. So, to cut a long story short, member states are free to decide whether to privatize or not. They are not completely competent to decide the content of this privatization law and subsequently the exercise of this golden share. The content and the exercise of golden shares must comply with fundamental freedoms, and more specifically, as we said previously, freedom of establishment and free movement of capital. So it is easily understood that this distinction between the existence and the exercise of property rights, in our case golden shares, could draw the border between Article 345 and the fundamental freedoms. Now, another issue raised by this case has to do with the neutrality of the treaties and the European institutions towards privatizations. Is the EU really neutral towards privatizations? The Commission, contrary to Article 345, seems to favor privatizations. Moreover, certain primary and secondary EU law provisions, especially some economic policy or competition policy decisions, seem to favor privatizations. Moreover, in the bailout agreements of certain member states, such as Greece and Cyprus, there are specific requirements for privatizations. In their economic adjustment programs, there are specific provisions requiring privatizations, and in some cases, extensive privatizations. Here again, I'm citing an extract from the Greek MOU. According to the Greek MOU, Greece must fundamentally reduce the footprint of government in the economy through bold structural fiscal reforms and by privatizing public assets in order to rebalance the economy, support growth and employment, restore fiscal sustainability, and secure financial stability. Greece aims to accomplish a fundamental shift of public assets to private sector control. So it could be deduced that Article 345 has only limited applicability to heavily indebted member states bound by specific MOUs. This is the case of Greece, of course, as well as the case of Cyprus. The European Commission, as well as the Council, are members of these bailout agreements. Hence, it could be argued that the Commission and the Council, as members of these bailout programs, do not retain a neutral position towards privatizations, but they encourage them. So we see that these two institutions, instead of following this mandate of Article 345, they are adopting a quite friendly stance towards these privatizations. Now, another issue that comes from this case, Commission versus Greece, has to do with corporatizations. What is a corporatization? Corporatization is the transformation of a state-owned enterprise into a company governed by company law. A corporatization is a precursor to privatizations. So, if a member state possesses a certain state-owned enterprise, this state-owned enterprise is transformed into a company governed by company law, and then this specific company, commercial company, let's say, is being privatized. In our case, Commission versus Greece, the court was quite specific. This corporatization process must comply with fundamental freedoms. The Court of Justice held, again here I'm citing the relevant extract from the ECJ's decision, that if a state decided to transform public undertakings into public limited companies whose shares were quoted on stock exchange and could in principle be purchased freely on the market, allowing a non-state shareholder to establish itself in a significant way within those companies, as was the case of Greek strategic public limited companies. It could not be accepted that Article 345 might be invoked by a member state in order to remove such acquisitions from the ambit of fundamental freedoms. So the corporatization must respect fundamental freedoms. Yes, the transformation of public undertakings into public limited companies escape Article 345, but fall within the scope of freedom of establishment and free movement of capital. Member states, having decided to proceed to privatizations, must structure very carefully the corporatization process. This is the case of Cyprus. And Cyprus was the last victim of the euro crisis, and of course there was a bailout, sometimes called bail-in program for Cyprus. It depends. And in the MOU that Cyprus agreed, there were specific provisions on privatizations of state-owned enterprises and the so-called semi-governmental organizations, organizations governed by public law. Cyprus must proceed to a corporatization of state-owned enterprises. There are specific requirements for this process in the Cyprus MOU, and the Cyprus government plans to start the corporatization soon. So it is easily understood that Cyprus government must be quite careful in order to structure its corporatization law in accordance with EU fundamental freedoms. Otherwise, a possible infringement of fundamental freedoms might delay the privatization process, and as a matter of fact, the goals of the economic adjustment program of Cyprus. Now, a few conclusions. While member states are free to decide whether a public undertaking would be privatized, this is the policy decision, the content of this decision, the exercise of this decision, the exercise of the golden share, falls within the scope of fundamental freedoms, and as a matter of fact, it must comply with them. The privatization laws of member states, stipulating the details of the privatization process, and the various stages and conditions, including, of course, the golden shares that we mentioned, the property ownership rights, under which a privatization will take place, must be compatible with the fundamental freedoms. There is no way escaping this requirement. The bailout agreements of Greece and Cyprus required extensive privatizations, which must comply with internal market rules. Otherwise, as we mentioned, possible infringements of fundamental freedoms caused by either the golden shares themselves or the corporatization process might obstruct the privatization programs of these member states, and as a result, the realization of the economic adjustment programs. And of course, the jurisprudential directions, we have a long thread of case law here that the golden shares case law provides, are really important for these over-indebted member states bound by bailout agreements. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope that I complied with the time limits.
Thank you very much for a very interesting discussion on privatizations and corporate. Can you repeat the term?
Thank you so much.
The term which was introduced to me, a newly defined term, corporatization.
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 Yes.
So very interesting
yes.
distinction between the three, and hopefully we can discuss more on that following the presentations. And now we'll move on to a political discussion on Greece by Mrs. Ioanna Tamboudi from Aston University in the UK, who's a PhD candidate there, who will talk about looking ahead of the debt crisis, a political perspective on building a new economic identity for Greece.
Hello everybody, I'm a PhD student in my third year. I belong to the discipline of political sociology, so I'm gonna try to make my presentation relevant to the topic of stimulating business and law. So the title of my, first of all, let me introduce to you my PhD topic so that you can understand where it is I come from and how and why it is the reasons why I focus on the issues of national identity and national identity rebuilding and rebranding. So my PhD topic focuses on national and European identities in Greece during the Eurozone crisis. So basically what I have done during the last few months is going around and asking Greek citizens about their opinions about the origins of the crisis, and about their opinions about the ways that the crisis has constructed the Greek national identity as problematic in its own right and as problematic in the European Union as well. And also I was trying to look at whether these public perceptions have some sort of effect in the kind of, the degree and the quality of support that Greek citizens have for EU membership and European integration in general. So the title of my presentation is Looking Beyond the Debt Crisis, a Political Perspective. So, oops, sorry. So, in the European context, we witness a lot of different issues and problems. We witness the shrinking of national economies, the sovereign debt crisis all over Europe. We recognize that there needs to be growth and sustainable development. There are issues of welfare and living standards that have been impoverished during the last few years. In some countries more than others, obviously. There is the issue of unemployment and the question of how to create jobs. And if anyone looks at the last Eurobarometer data, one of the first issues that comes to the public's mind is how the European Union could create jobs for people, and especially young people. Also, the question of education is a very important issue, and how to maintain adequate standards and give all the opportunities to young people. On the other hand, there is enough educational capital, and we see also the opposite effect, that there is a lot of wastage of human capital. I mean, how does it matter if anyone has a lot of education if they can actually apply the things that they know? So there is a lot of skilled labor that is being lost. And these are issues that operate in all the European countries, not only Greece. The state of democracy as well has become an issue the last few years, EU-wide. The social cohesion and the political antagonisms that have emerged, the populism, the nationalism, the cross-national antagonisms and nationalisms. We see that the relations between different European nations have become more intense, especially, for example, between Greece and Germany. Things are a little bit acrimonious at times. And of course, we see at the European level the gaps of solidarity, the gaps of the deficit of cooperation and unity. Now, in the Greek context, of course, it is fair to say that Greece has been hit the hardest by the economic crisis for a variety of reasons, because of domestic shortcomings, because of the context where Greece operates, and the shortcomings, the systemic shortcomings of the Eurozone, and of course the global financial crisis. So there are all these different levels. Greece happens to be the one country that doesn't seem to have signs of substantial recovery. And we see that in the last few years, Portugal and Ireland and Cyprus are on their way out of the crisis, but Greece is still very much in it. So there has been, of course, severe cuts and austerity and so on that have been very consequential for the internal market and for polity as well. So this has caused, of course, the political instability and the last elections and the rise of Syriza to the governing position. And since then, the European relations have been very challenged. And of course, we have this pre-existing discourse of the Greek question in the EU and the narrative of explaining the problems of Greece that is very much about clientelism and this kind of practices. So in the context of the crisis, what has happened with the Greek national identity is that the Greek culture has been very much blamed and the national identity has been adversely affected. So the traditional discourses that we have to explain the crisis go very much back to the famous Diamandouros thesis about underdogs and modernizers inside the Greek political culture. And actually, I think that it came up in the Q&A session before, when it was mentioned about populism and clientelism. So we still go back to these kind of narratives to explain what has really gone wrong with Greece. Of course, the answer to the clientelism and populism sort of dimension of political culture was the culture of reform and modernization, and the modernization in the case of Greece was very much linked to Europeanization processes. And this has created constructed dilemmas between nationalism and Europeanism and so on, but often at times this discourse of reform has been very abstract, it has been very ineffective. We can also say that it has been a little bit arrogant because it goes against people and so on, and maybe even elitist. So, about crisis management. There is a lot of talk about austerity and cuts, but there is not enough talk about growth and development. So, and one of the things that has been really missing inside the crisis, and it is very understandable where it is missing, is the question of visionary politics and the question of vision for the future. So these kind of things have been lost in the context of intense negotiations, in the context of urgency that exists. So I'm looking at the work of Bond and his colleagues and how they argue that national identities have a very strong economic component and that the history and culture of a nation represents the identity resources that are used in the construction of its economic identity and the economic reimagining. So what I'm trying to argue in this paper is that we need to reimagine the economic identity of Greece. The identities of countries or of institutions or of individuals are multidimensional. One of the dimensions is the economic, so we need to start thinking about strategies and discursive and material and practical strategies of how to do that, how to imagine a different economic identity for Greece. So there are some examples of reimagining that have been going on at the grassroots. The one kind is campaigns and initiatives, such as the one called Repower Greece, which was an international campaign of public democracy that was aiming to promote new attitudes and to counteract the negative stereotypes about Greece and that have been circulating in the national and international community. Some other initiatives have been media texts and with representations of stories, personal stories of entrepreneurialism, creating one's own job, and how the necessity has become the mother of invention. So positive stories about Greeks taking control of their lives and trying to make a difference in the context of the crisis. Some activities that have been represented in this kind of text, and I find very interesting the fact that this kind of texts I have usually found them on magazines, in airlines, while traveling on the plane. There is a magazine, and inside these magazines there are this kind of texts, and I'm thinking that is this a strategic sort of approach to kind of expose these narratives and discourses to an international audience? So these are the photographs of these initiatives, Repower Greece, and the kind of aim that we have, reclaiming our credibility that can only be achieved through actions and stories that reflect the achievements and skills and talents of many rather than the failures of a few. That's the message that we're trying to put out. And also this article about how to save a city, and it represents modern Greek heroes like trying to make a difference and so on in the business and entrepreneurial sort of area. So this has been going on at the bottom up level, at the grassroots level, but we need to think about how governments could facilitate with that, and how there needs to be a top-down approach to this in the reimagining of the national economic identity, because at the grassroots it's very difficult to be organized and to have some sort of effect. These are things that obviously the government at the moment has, they have their hands tied and they are occupied with other things, but this is something to build for the future. There needs to be a strategy, and also EU governments can support with that. They could approach the case of Greece with a focus on growth, development, with a focus on the future and how the country could actually get out of the crisis, instead of just worrying about how the payments will be made to the IMF or how to the foreign banks and so on. So instead of using discourses of reform and modernization that have come to be very suspicious and very hostile for citizens, we should be talking about strategies. We need a strategy for the future, how to rebuild. So strategy is a much more citizen-friendly concept, I would argue, and we need to focus on specific problems instead of blaming the general culture. We need to diagnose specific issues, like such as the lack of production. Greece needs to have a productive base, and this is the primary thing that we should be focusing on, and also compliance to laws and professionalism. So my conclusion is that such an alternative policy and strategy could go a longer way in mobilizing the Greek civil society around the common purposes, and it would capitalize much better on the evidently existing public desire for social change and the perceived positive particularities of Greek society. And yes, that's pretty much it. I will just stop here and answer questions later.
Thank you very much, Ioanna. And yes, if we can link Ioanna's presentation with the presentation Thomas provided us with, it's definitely the case that there's a cultural component linked to Greece, which we should not neglect in our discussion on Greece, and also the fact that if we are discussing about privatizations of public companies, that does link very well to the need to have a strategy and a vision like most companies have, so why shouldn't a state need the same, especially when it's in financial troubles. So I'll open up the floor for 10 minutes. We're quite conscious of time, so I'll open up the floor to any questions or points the audience would like to make before we go on to our third discussion.
Hello. Hello, my name is Katerina Argiru. I'm a PhD student at Utrecht University in the Netherlands. I really enjoyed your presentation. I see, actually I missed this cultural aspect, and I had this discussion before that we definitely need to see at the cultural aspects of the crisis. I really enjoyed the fact that you see entrepreneurialism as a solution, but I was wondering whether maybe you have followed the discussion and the need of social entrepreneurship and social economy in Greece and the rise of it. So Tineke later on will talk about it. It's my subject of the subject of my PhD, and I was because you talked about social cohesion and the empowerment of society and about social change, and these are subjects that social entrepreneurship gives solutions, and it's not very famous to Greece. Actually, it was introduced in 2011 by George Papandreou, and it was, maybe it was more criticized than used in terms of policy. But I would like to listen to your, I don't know if you are familiar with the concept, but I would like to listen to your perspective in this.
It is on now. I'm not very familiar, because I don't come from the business kind of background. I'm not too familiar with the question of entrepreneurialism and how to, the very practical aspects and legal aspects of how to go about it. But it seems to me that obviously, the state and the government has an obligation and a responsibility for the welfare of the citizens, and they need to provide things such as social benefits, and they need to have a safety net for when things go wrong and so on, and they need to be able to provide. But on the other hand, there's also the problem that at times they cannot provide, and this is probably one of those moments. And citizens need to, I feel that as citizens we need to find, we need to have our own initiatives as well, not just to depend on the government. That doesn't excuse the government from its responsibilities, that's not what I'm saying, but we need to make for our own. We need to take care of our own part as well. And yes, in the crisis, one of the things that happened was that a lot of people tried to create their own jobs. So that's a very positive step. But of course, this is very small scale, and there needs to be a policy at the government level to have for the future how to build the productive base that Greece lacks, which is the primary, if we had to choose one issue, that would be it to fix. Make our own money, basically, how to have a productive base. And that can only happen at the economic policy level from the top down, from the government. So, yeah, that's the only solution I can possibly see.
Thank you. This probably sounds like a really naive question, but I'm just wondering, what is the trade union movement like in Greece? I mean, in the UK, it has been weakened severely, and I suspect that's the case in Greece. But I just wonder if there's any leeway or any leverage in that route.
Either of you?
Sorry. Oh, okay. We have trade unions in Greece, and we have unionism in general. We've always had and always been very active, and so on. But they have been criticized, and for good reasons. But they have become part of the system and part of the disease, in a sense, because they have this sort of tenure positions in the unions, and they have these kind of benefits, and they are, they receive these payments to be activists, but that's very kind of controversial. So it's not it is a controversial and criticized kind of dimension of this aspect of union politics. Yes, I don't know I don't know a lot about it. I've never been active in this sort of thing, so from personal experience, I don't really know much, but this is what I have heard.
Thank you for two very interesting presentations. I have a question for the first speaker on golden shares. I was sitting thinking about, we had a presentation recently at Oslo by an Italian visiting scholar who was speaking about the state as a controlling shareholder in Italy. And from that type of perspective, you can really understand the need for European rules that provide some rule of law and a level playing field. But on the other hand, listening to your presentation, I was wondering whether the application of the freedom of movement rules in this area, combined at least in this situation with the strong international and European pressure on Greece to privatize, whether this kind of application of these rules that the Court of Justice has shown us, is it, in your opinion, a too broad tool, a too coarse tool to try to achieve something which is actually good, but perhaps then destroying other good consequences of what Greece is trying to do at the same time?
Thank you very much for your question. The first golden share case was decided in 2000. Since then, we have over a dozen cases decided by the ECJ. We see that member states are persistent. They are adopting golden shares, but they are not taking the well-established case law of the ECJ. The problem is that it's not that the member states cannot be major shareholders in a privatized company. The problem is that they must take into account the requirements that the ECJ had set. And there was one case, the Commission versus Belgium, where Belgium managed to justify this introduction of special rights. For example, there was a quite consolidated administrative framework. I mean, the Belgian administration was bound by this specific framework. The proportionality principle was also respected. I mean, there are certain standards existing in this case, but still we see that even now there are member states that are infringing these rules. Some other countries, for example, Poland, that had proceeded to some privatizations, they respected this case law and they proceeded to their privatizations in accordance with this case law. So, yes.
Maybe since there are no more questions from the floor, maybe I can ask one last question to Thomas. In Greece, I think it's been the subject of much debate, the issue of privatization and also which enterprises should be privatized. And there's a lot of suspicion surrounding that concept. So from your presentation, I understood that on the one hand, with the cases, one must comply with the terms, and it's not necessarily the case that privatizations are the objective, but rather the terms should be complied with. And then on the other hand, you mentioned the economic adjustment program, and there that's a completely different issue because privatizations are, in fact, the suggestion. It's not about terms. So I wanted to ask you we got very interesting papers on a legal and political aspect, but if we move away from the legal analysis of your paper, how do you think all these interlink with each other? The program, the freedoms, and nationalism also, because actually member states are interested in protecting their local markets and not being exposed. So what's your point on that?
We could approach privatizations from different point of views. We could approach them from a legal point of view, from a political point of view, or from economics. As a lawyers, we stick into the case law and the various requirements that the MOUs are setting. So the decision whether to proceed to a privatization, this is a policy issue. This is excluded from the scope of the fundamental freedoms. The court has no right to examine the decision of a member state whether to proceed to a privatization or not. But when the state decides to privatize a specific state-owned enterprise, then this must be done in accordance with internal market rules. Almost 10 years ago, many people were congratulating the Portuguese government for their wide privatization program. They said that this was a very successful privatization program that took place. But we saw that almost 5-6 years ago, the European Commission initiated infringement proceedings against Portugal, and almost all the privatizations, not almost all, I think 5 or 6 of them, were infringing the fundamental freedoms. So, yes, the decision, whether to privatize or not, is something different from the content and the exercise of the special rights. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much for that comment. And now we'll move on to Mr. Kyriakidis from the Politics Department at the University of Sheffield, who will discuss the Greek crisis, the MOUs, and the effect on the Greek business environment.
Is this okay? It's working. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to speak at this very prestigious conference, and especially Dr. Lina Papadopoulou, Associate Professor. I'm sorry, Lina Papadopoulou. One mustn't forget the titles, and Professor Beate especially for giving me the opportunity to present. Keeping true to my undergraduate USA education, I thought I'd come down from the floor, because it's more democratic like that. I am a political scientist, which means I'm not a legal scholar, which means I am perhaps political science could be characterized as the younger brother, the more aggressive brother and the more realistic brother of law. Let's see the first slide. So keeping true to that, my dissertation, which I, fingers crossed, submitted 2.5 years from the start of my program, so I'm close to the end, hopefully, concerns the democratic deficit of the European Union and the Eurozone crisis. And it's very simple, it deals with two things: the supranational level, i.e. the EU level, and then the national level, i.e. Greece. Obviously, the presentation is going to be much, much more limited to the effect of the structural adjustment programs, which is the million-dollar phrase, okay? Structural adjustment programs. And their effect on the Greek business environment. But I'll be happy to take any questions for any Eurozone issues as well. So I thought, how would you estimate from a political science point of view, right? Because I'm not a legal scholar and I'm not an economist either. Maybe a political economist, but that could be a stretch. So how would you go about it? So the first thing you have to do is you have to introduce yourself, which is the introduction. But the second thing you have to do is you have to evaluate the temporal aspect of the crisis, okay? So what happened and when? And what were the consequences of what was happening? And surprising as it is, you can discover a great amount of information and great amount of detail when you actually sit down and look at what happened. I mean, obviously these things have been told over and over again, but no one really looks. You know, everyone takes it for granted. This is what happened then, this is what happened then. No one really looks at what actually happened. And the second part, keeping true to the espousement I share with the legal scholars in the attention to detail, is a document analysis, right? I'm Greek, I share the legal scholars' attention to detail, so I have to look at documents, right? It's a Greek tradition almost. And then I evaluate the impact, okay? So 1, the time, 2, what has been written, and then what the impact is. Let's go ahead. Okay, so the Eurozone crisis, I'll go through it very quickly. I'll go through these very quickly. The Eurozone crisis firstly occurred as across the Atlantic. It started as a subprime mortgage crisis, okay? So credit was cheap. Banks started giving out subprimes and alternative A-paper mortgages, yada, 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 economics 101, okay? The bubble bursts in 2007 and 8. Now, what most people do not realize is that the first country to implement austerity within the Eurozone was Ireland. Because Ireland had the same exposure to subprime mortgages, or a similar type of exposure, such as the United States did. So they moved to guarantee 400 billion euros, all their bank loans, they moved to guarantee them, and introduced austerity. Now, the issue didn't receive broad attention at the time, because no one thought that the Eurozone was ever going to suffer from a crisis, okay? People thought this was a possibility that would never happen. And I won't go into the issue unless I'm asked whether it's an optimal currency area, whether an optimal currency area is possible, et cetera, I won't go into that. So, in 2008, that happened, and then the first 3 countries, yeah, just go ahead, oh, wow, okay, you can't see that, but okay. So the first 3 countries to resort to EU and IMF assistance were actually outside the Eurozone. That's also another fact that no one really mentions, okay? It was Hungary, Latvia, and Romania. Now, as you can imagine, being outside the Eurozone, and because of the specific provision in EU treaties that they can receive financial assistance, EU member states, not Eurozone member states, no one, again, really cared. You know, they were the Central and Eastern European countries, former Soviet republics, you know, economics were a little bit dodgy, introduction into the more liberal economy of the West caused many problems. So what if they asked assistance? So what if they signed an MOU? So that was the beginning of the crisis, which later followed with 5 Eurozone member states, the first of which you know very well was Greece, which also received a second loan afterwards, Portugal, Spain, Ireland, Portugal, Spain, and then Cyprus. We can go ahead. Okay, so the Greek crisis. Once again, very quickly, 2004, 2007, new democracy administration plagued with scandals. I dare to imagine, I'm afraid to imagine, if any other government that was plagued by so many scandals, consecutive scandals, political scandals, at the time, okay? You have Siemens AG, the communications sector of Siemens AG. You have catastrophic fires in the summer of 2007. You have the Vatopedi. Okay, so this tension is building up. Ministers are resigning. Parliamentary committees are being convened. Blah, blah, blah. Everyone is like fed up with this. And then on top of everything else, you have the crisis, okay? So the crisis hits, boom. So after 2 consecutive terms, they call for snap elections. Snap elections happen. New democracy, we're going to cut wages. PASOK, no, we'll give you wage raises above inflation. We shouldn't cut wages. Where are the people going to go? They were already so fed up with all the political turmoil that New Democracy suffered. And one political actor was telling them, we're going to cut wages. Another political actor was telling them, we're going to give you money, essentially. So they voted for PASOK, okay? October 2009. So they get elected. Once they get elected, whoops, 1 week within their election, the prime minister and then the minister for finance comes out and says, oh, we're sorry. Yeah, we were going to give you money, but the previous administration underestimated our deficit. So it's going to be a little bit more than 6%. It's going to be 12. Double. Economic death. Okay? Desolation of the Greek economy. Obviously, the credit rating agencies were not really Greece's friends, sometimes rightfully so, because their economy is not very good. CRAs downgrade the economy to trash, okay? Immediate credit crunch. No one can borrow. Banks cannot borrow. The state cannot borrow. Boom. That's the beginning of the Eurozone sovereign debt crisis, okay? Yeah, go ahead. Okay. So, in 2009, that's what happened, revised the deficit, et cetera, et cetera. In 2010, a first law of austerity is introduced, but that's a mediocre, that's like a patch at best, okay? So, in May 2010, the Prime Minister says, oh, I'm sorry, I was going to do all these good things, but now I can't because, the markets won't allow it. So I have to ask for assistance. That was the first time a Eurozone member state ever asked assistance, all right? And more tragic was the fact that it asked assistance from the IMF as well. As you probably are aware, the International Monetary Fund does not see eye to eye with the European Central Bank on what's the best policy, right? It's Washington-based. That's why it wasn't a very ideal request for assistance. But as it turned out later, Germany insisted on the IMF participating because of its extensive experience in bailing out countries. Austerity, the MOUs, tremendous policy drift, okay? 180-degree turn. People did not know where the changes were coming from, okay? They were in a constant state of vertigo. Everything changed within one night, everything. Every single piece of legislation that the Greek state had for years changed immediately, and we'll see how. So, okay, so in 2007, the money is not enough. So they say, all right, we'll go to the second agreement, again. But obviously, the government of PASOK could not really implement the measures because of tremendous protests that happened across 2010 and 11. People did not like what was proposed, mainly because the internal devaluation that was happening was awful for the people. So he couldn't implement it, said, okay, well, this is what I'll do. I'll resign, and then I'll agree with the other parties in parliament to assign a temporary government to implement the second agreement, the second loan, and then we'll have elections. And so it happened. In between happened a tremendous announcement for a referendum, which was shocking. And so in July 2011, the second agreement, and in October, the referendum comes on. Let's go ahead. And then the second MOU in March 2012 under the cooperation government of Dr. Papadimos. Elections in April, no government wins, but huge rise at the left, Syriza, which had 4% and now had, 20%. Huge rise in Golden Dawn. right? Okay, so politics 101, okay? So in crisis periods, the people, citizens, voters move to the edges, okay? No government, repeat elections, as one would expect, repeat elections, the first two parties, so New Democracy and Syriza, have a boost because people feel uncertain. And a cooperation government between New Democracy and PASOK and DIMAR is formed after the second elections, right? Again, New Democracy had run on an electoral platform that was somewhat anti-MOU, at least anti-MOU policy mix, and it was also anti-austerity, all right? So growth, et cetera, gets elected, oh, policy drift again. I'm sorry, 4 minutes, all right. Oh, we have to go quickly, okay. So I'm sorry, so and then 2015 general elections. So the structural adjustment, two parts. Yeah, just go ahead, yeah. The one part is the excessive deficit procedure, okay? So the excessive deficit procedure is an EU-based instrument. And a lot of people don't realize that, but the excessive deficit procedure came before the MOUs and had exactly the same measures. Exactly. Very soon, though, the European partners realized, probably, don't take me to the bank for it, but they realized that conditionality was low because the excessive deficit procedure, as you all know, as an EU treaty procedure, does not have strong sanctions. So they said, okay, we'll do a loan agreement and MOU as well, which is the IMF's tool, all right? So the loan agreements are those you see right there. By the way, these data do not exist anywhere in the form that I'm showing them, so I'd appreciate if you didn't steal them. All right, let's go ahead. And the memorandums of understanding, okay? 20 memorandums of understanding in total. 2 major ones, and then 18 updates. Now people say updates, you know, that's like changing the name. No, it's not really. You know, they put the one out, and then everything else, they change everything else in the updates. It's shocking. They add things and they retract things. Let's go ahead. These are the areas that impact the business environment: budget, revenue, energy, labor market, healthcare, education, tourism. Essentially, every policy in the Greek state changed, right, with the MOUs. Transportation, social security, banks, procurement, research and development, and privatization, all right? And there is also a very, very detailed privatization schedule for each quarter, by the way, all right? These are, well, you can't see that, but these are the pages of the MOUs that reference each of these changes. Let's go ahead. These are the Greek laws that enforced all the changes, okay? Because many people say, oh, you know, this argument has been heard time and again. Say, oh, you know, we committed to that, but we didn't really implement it. Yeah, no, they did. It just, no one really looks at what goes through Parliament, okay? So all the changes, I can guarantee you, every single one that affected the Greek business environment was actually passed as a Greek law. So, what were the measures? Increase VAT, so value-added tax, right? Increase taxes, presumption